caught between Belarus and Poland. Thousands of people are pushed from border to border as a humanitarian crisis unfolds on the edge of the European Union. But is it a man-made disaster orchestrated by a regime out for revenge? I'm Andrei Sannikov, and today's newsmaker is the crisis on the Belarus-Poland border. There's a 400-kilometer border between Belarus and Poland, and Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki says it is not just a line on a map, it's sacred. Tensions have been simmering for weeks, but on Monday they reached boiling point when thousands of people at the Belarusian border tried to cross into Poland and onto EU soil. Now, many are from the Middle East, and most want to pass through Poland into Western Europe.
Help! No go to Poland. We are go to Germany. Germany is life. No Poland.
Well, according to Polish authorities, more than 30,000 migrants have tried to illegally enter the country since August. And Warsaw, the EU, and NATO all blame Belarus. Minsk is accused of pushing migrants to the border to orchestrate a crisis as punishment for sanctions imposed by the bloc. Earlier, the Polish Prime Minister visited his troops on the border and accused the regime of Alexander Lukashenko of using civilians as political pawns.
We know that this is a fully planned operation, which aims to disrupt the sovereignty of our country. That's absolutely clear to us. We know for sure that there is a search for weak spots happening on our border. Who would think 1, 2, 3 months ago that we will be dealing with actions that have a character of using human shields? President Alexander Lukashenko's regime uses civilians as weapons of a hybrid war. What we can see today are new methods, and you are a key bastion there to defend against these new methods.
Well, Belarus has denied any wrongdoing and instead blames Poland, accusing them of inhumane treatment, forcing migrants to take drastic steps. Now, the relationship between the EU member states and Belarus has been strained for some time. In June, Belarus was sanctioned after authorities forced a Ryanair flight to land in Minsk to arrest an opposition journalist on board. Then in August, further sanctions were imposed over a violent crackdown on protesters demonstrating against Lukashenko's controversial re-election, which the opposition claims was rigged. And now, the European Union is calling for additional measures, warning Belarus against attempts to destabilize the bloc by manufacturing a migrant crisis. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen released this statement on Twitter.
Belarus must stop putting people's lives at risk. I spoke to Mateusz Morawiecki, Ingrida Shimonite, and Christianis Kerens. I call for approval of extended sanctions, possible sanctions on third country airlines involved. We also want to prevent a humanitarian crisis and ensure safe returns.
The European Commission says there are now around 2,000 people at the border, and they're expecting more to arrive. Camps have begun forming in the forest as the asylum seekers try to protect themselves from the cold. Temperatures are already dropping below freezing at night, and it is reported at least 9 people have died in recent weeks. But thousands are still willing to take the risk in search of a better life.
They're just wanting to go to there for a better future for their kids, and that's all they want. They're innocent people who want a better future for their kids. Like so many of them doesn't have food, water. They have small kids and they're freezing, and the weather is pretty cold. That's all I have to say.
Well, to discuss the current crisis, I'm joined now from Warsaw by Andrei Sannikov. He was Belarus's former deputy foreign minister. He ran for president in 2010 and was a political prisoner during Lukashenko's 4th term. Aleks Szczerbiak is in Brighton. He's a professor of politics and contemporary European studies at the University of Sussex. And Pieter Cleppe is the head of the Brussels office of Open Europe and editor-in-chief of BrusselsReport.eu. Thanks all so much for being with me. Aleks, I'll start with you. I mean, just how brazen is this? You know, Belarus isn't going to convince anyone that thousands of Syrians, Iraqis, and Afghans are applying for Belarusian tourist visas just to see Minsk for fun. And the EU has now said that migrants and refugees are actually being told by Belarus that they can freely enter the EU via Minsk. Have you ever seen anything like this before? And if true, does it equate to a crime?
Yeah, I haven't seen anything like this before. This is obviously a very serious escalation of a crisis that has been going on since the summer, since August. In the summer, the Polish government referred to this as a hybrid war. This was, small groups of migrants being escorted to the border, trying to get across in ones and twos or small groups, gradually escalating over a series of weeks. But this, I think, is a major upping of the ante on this. I mean, huge groups of migrants on the Polish border. And I think when you're in situations like that, I mean, obviously, the border guards in Poland face a serious challenge in terms of maintaining the integrity of the Polish borders. But there's also the danger that a spark can set off a much more serious conflict in that area. So I think the Polish government is taking this extremely seriously. It views this as a major hostile act by Belarus, part of a campaign it's been running for a couple of months, but a really serious escalation of that crisis.
Okay. Andrei, having lived both in Belarus and Poland, knowing the governments of both countries very well, have you or could you have ever foreseen a situation like this?
Yes, of course. Not only I could have foreseen the situation, I think I was telling about it for a number of years already, because Lukashenko, I believe, threatened it more than 5 years ago that he will use illegal migration as a tool against European Union if they don't behave. And the European Union at that time behaved. They lifted sanctions in 2016, and now they are facing consequences because this is started not in August. I have to correct my colleague Alex. It started in spring with the migration crisis on the borders with Lithuania, and it was escalating and developing and reaching the scale that we are seeing today. And I agree that it will be, we have to expect further escalation and something even more serious from Lukashenko.
Okay, Andrei, then how could this have been prevented? And also, what more serious action from Lukashenko do you expect to come?
He has threatened all kind of aggressive activities coming from his regime, like organized crime in Europe, like human trafficking, like drug trafficking. How it could have been prevented? You have to address the core of the problem, not the consequences, not the migration crowds today on the border with Poland, with Lithuania, with Latvia, but the dictatorial regime in the center of Europe, in European part.
Okay, but that's not an easy solution either. I mean, you're basically talking about displacing the regime of Alexander Lukashenko. The Belarusian people themselves haven't been able to do that.
We're not talking about easy solutions. We are talking about solutions. And I think that the European Union has tools and resources enough to deal with such situation. They were reluctant to notice the danger of the dictatorial regime of Lukashenko on its borders, and were reluctant to deal with it appropriately. Even when the protests started in large-scale protests that demonstrated that the overwhelming majority of people reject Lukashenko as the ruler of the country. Even then, the sanctions didn't come. Okay. And the European Union is still slow.
Let me ask Pieter Cleppe then. I mean, how could Belarus be punished now for this? The EU is talking about more sanctions being on the way, even though sanctions initially provoked this situation.
Well, exactly. It's sort of a tit-for-tat game now, but I think on the short term, the obvious way the obvious place to start is with the airlines that are transporting all these people, that are basically collaborating with the regime in Belarus. The EU could tell them, look, you lose your license to fly in the European Union if you continue to fly to Minsk, at least for a month. Of course, this would be quite a drastic step, but then if you see what's going on, we see a few thousand people trying to challenge Polish border guard. So this, I mean, at some point, this is no longer hybrid warfare. This is bordering warfare.
You're saying that the airlines need to be held responsible for this. But we're actually hearing reports, as I'm sure you're aware of these package offers being offered to people in Syria, Iraq, wherever else they may come from in the region, via agents arranging everything for them for thousands of euros and getting these tourist visas appropriately. That's not necessarily the airline's fault. If they have not been told they have to stop people who have the correct paperwork from boarding these flights, how do you expect them to be held responsible? And let's make that policy now.
Well, I completely understand that indeed the airlines, for them, it's hard. But then I'm not saying that they should be banned to fly to Minsk forever, but maybe for the next month or so. I mean, we have an emergency situation, and then it's indeed really sad for people that have to really fly from Istanbul or from Baghdad to Minsk. That's true. I mean, they'll have to find another way, but at least you can sort of on a relatively short term.
Sure, but what's a bit distressing, I think, for the airlines is that the EU has now threatened to sanction certain airlines that have been following the rules. They're getting the correct paperwork from these passengers. The Belarusians have been issuing these visas for them to come through. Technically, the airlines don't have the right to stop them. So the EU really does need to get moving on some new policy here, does it not?
Well, look, I think back to the airlines, I think stopping some routes is something that airlines can perfectly do. It is going to cost them money. But I mean, again, this is an emergency situation. So I think at the short term, you can easily end at least this scheme. Of course, then supposedly Lukashenko may try to come up with another method to get people to Belarus, to then, try to encourage them to illegally trespass the Polish border. So I think that points at the fact that this would only be a short-term fix. On the long term, the problem is that if you enter the European Union's territory, you are pretty sure that you will be able to stay, even if you have been denied asylum. And that's the weakness that Belarus is now exploiting.
Okay. So, Alex, let me ask you this. I mean, right now, if Belarus allowed them to fly in, why is it not on Minsk to fly them out? They've probably overstayed their Belarusian tourist visas at this point anyway. So can there not be international law pressuring Belarus now to take care of the migrants that are on its territory?
Well, yes, I'm sure there could be, but I very much doubt that Belarus would really take very much notice of that. I mean, I think Belarus will start to retreat from this when it comes to the conclusion that it's not effective, and at the moment it's having a desired effect, which is it's destabilizing the situation on the EU's eastern border. It's causing a considerable debate within Poland. The Polish political situation is very polarized, and the government has a lot of critics. And obviously, part of what he's doing is trying to destabilize the situation in Poland, and obviously putting pressure on the rest of the EU. Because, as Peter said, once these people, once they get across the border, then they become not just Poland's problem or Lithuania's problem, they can be the EU's problem. And they don't really want to go to Poland. I mean, they want to go to further west, and Germany in particular, but other countries. And this is why it's obviously an issue, not just for Poland, because Poland is ultimately not where they want to end up being. I mean, Poland is being punished because Poland, along with the Baltic states, was in the vanguard of pushing for sanctions on the Belarusian regime. And he's trying to play on divisions within Poland on this issue. But ultimately, it's the pressures directed at the whole of the EU.
Andrei, let me ask you, though, from a Belarusian perspective, how is this worth it for Minsk? What does Belarus actually win here? Is it only a short-term victory that will have serious long-term consequences, or is there a long-term strategy here?
Well, I really don't like Belarus being used as a country of creating this crisis. The regime of Lukashenko, we know it very well, and he tries to create as many conflicts and now international conflicts as possible, because he failed inside. He is not controlling the economy of the country. He is controlling only the so-called siloviki, to put more pressure on the society, to unleash more repression, to use COVID as a tool for the repression. So he is trying to gain many things. He is trying to make Europe to kneel again before him, and to make concessions and stop sanctioning him. And I think that will be the fatal mistake if it ever happens, because this regime must go. And there is no Belarus-Polish crisis. This is the crisis organized by Lukashenko, well prepared, well orchestrated, which is directed at Europe. It is the Europe has to react to this crisis and to take measures to deal with it, because it is not for Poland and not for Lithuania to deal with it.
But it's not just Belarus, Andrei. We know that Russia is also playing a role here. That's a little more difficult for the EU to take on a grand scale at this point. Talk to us a bit about what you think Russia might be playing here behind the scenes.
I think it's not already behind the scenes, because Lukashenko and Putin met virtually online to sign the agreements about the further integration of, or I would say incorporation of Belarus into Russia with the help of Lukashenko on the 4th of November. And after that, they spoke hour and a half on the phone, and they on purpose released the information, they never did it before, that they mostly discussed the situation on Polish border. So it was a warning that something was coming. And unfortunately, there was no reaction on illegal approval of documents that are in danger, that are undermining the independence of Belarus from the West. And now they have the full-scale crisis on the borders. It was coming. It was known that it was coming. And Russia, since Russia implicated itself in this crisis, it has to be punished as well. So the sanctions has to be addressed at Kremlin also, connected with this crisis.
Peter, let me ask you then, from the Polish perspective, we've been hearing more about Poland kind of being the victim here, that they have just seen this massive flow of migrants and they have a right in many ways to protect their border, and that they're not equipped to take in thousands of asylum seekers right now. But really, is Poland being helpful here? I mean, they've stopped journalists and aid workers now from getting to many of those who are stuck on the border. Are they also in violation of international law? Because this isn't just a security crisis, this is a humanitarian crisis.
Well, if it's indeed the case that Poland stopped people from being treated, from getting medical help, of course, that's not something that can be supported. But as I mentioned, I mean, this is resembling a warlike situation. And to see a government then imposing certain restrictions for who can enter the zone where these tensions are happening now, I don't think that's so unreasonable. But yeah, I think it's a facts discussion. You know, how far can you go of keeping media away? Of course, if people slip through the border, they should be helped. I mean, that's obvious. I think the priority should be to help people to make sure that they're fine. But at the same time, of course, try to make sure that this little scheme of the Belarus regime is ended as soon as possible.
Right. I mean, Aleks, do you fear that this now could escalate into something along the lines of violent military clashes?
Well, I mean, I think that risk is always there when you've got such an unstable situation on the border. And obviously, you know, I mean, border guards are, I mean, you know, these are people that, you know, carry firearms, you know, potentially. There's always a spark that could set things off and make them much more serious. And, you know, I'm sure Lukashenko knows this. I'm sure this is all part of the game plan. And I think this sort of also relates to this question that you asked, if I might just comment on it, about the state of emergency. So obviously, I mean, this is one of the areas where there is a debate within Poland whether there should be a state of emergency in those border regions. And the opposition in particular argues that, that the media and some aid workers should be allowed there. And obviously the Polish government's response is very much along the lines of what Peter said. And this was obviously prior to the escalation of the crisis, which is, effectively we're in a situation where the conditions are similar to a conflict situation, and therefore extraordinary measures have to be taken. And also, it was something that it did have the support of people actually living in those regions who felt very uncomfortable about large numbers of organisations, the media, kind of moving in there. I think the other thing to say is that this specifically about aid workers. I mean, one of the Polish government's arguments is that the problem with the aid workers was that they were actually trying to get aid to people who weren't actually in Poland. And, they were actually trying to cross the border, not through a proper border crossing. I mean, the Polish government actually offered to send aid through to people stuck on the other side of the Belarusian border through a border crossing. It actually offered to send lorries of aid through to those people stuck in that area on the Belarusian side of the border, and the Belarusian government refused that offer. And the Polish government says, so, they said this isn't about a humanitarian crisis. It's about weaponizing these people and using them in what was originally a hybrid war, and something that, as you said, in a very tense situation, could actually escalate into something much, much more serious.
Andrei, quickly, you being in Poland, I mean, how do you think this is making the Polish people feel on a more political level? Is it pushing them further to the right? Has this become kind of a rallying point for Poles right now?
I would agree with Peter that it is a warlike situation and different laws should apply. I don't agree that it's a humanitarian crisis. It's a crisis created by Lukashenko to attack Europe, to attack Poland. And I wouldn't say about the attitude of Poles towards this situation, but I know that the approval rating of the government actions as regards this crisis is growing. And people do understand that the government, the troops, the police are protecting the borders of Poland and are protecting their citizens. So I don't think that Poles are in for the political debate here. They want to get rid of this danger on its borders. So I think that they are fully supporting, majority of Poles are supporting the government activities, and I think that they consider them to be adequate and appropriate at this time.
Okay. Peter, I have to end with this, and if you can tell us, what are the options now for the migrants who are there? As the weather gets colder, will there be transport offered eventually to take them back to their countries of origin? I know you had mentioned that there's a way to possibly look at outsourcing asylum processing to third countries, as Denmark and the UK have done. Tell us what you think the options are.
Well, Denmark and the UK are trying to do that. So far, they have failed. So indeed, if you're pretty sure that when you are denied asylum, you can stay in the European Union, then yeah, let's keep on trying. And then this then enables autocrats like Lukashenko to play on that. Ideally, indeed, people should be given the right to apply for asylum, but they should only then be able to enter EU territory after they have received a yes. What Denmark is trying to do is indeed outsourcing, have an arrangement with a third country, in this case Rwanda.
What do you think should happen to these migrants on the border now then? What are their options?
I mean, well, of course, for them, if they are in the EU, they have to be helped, and they have to, they have to apply for asylum. If they are denied, then they have to be repatriated to their countries.
And I mean, overall, though, should Belarus just have to step up now and find a way to take them back before freezing temperatures hit even harder?
Well, yeah, of course, but then it's an evil regime, as we just discussed. So the question is, how realistic is that?
Okay. Peter, we'll have to end it there. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists, Andrei Sannikov, Aleks Szczerbiak, and Pieter Cleppe, of course, for joining us, and to our viewers for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter @the_newsmakers and continue the conversation there. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrei Sannikov. We'll see you next time.